Today's program is Land, Power, and Consequences, Stories of a Changing Environment. We have with us here today three outstanding environmental photographers, and I'm really excited to hear and see their work momentarily. So with us today are Peter Essick, Pat Kane, and Sara Hylton, and the program is moderated by Justin Dalaba. Justin is a multimedia producer and editor, telling stories through documentary photography and video. He currently works for Preserving Legacies, a National Geographic Society funded project and the largest global initiative dedicated to safeguarding heritage places and practices by advancing climate adaptation solutions. Originally trained as a conservation biologist, he embraced visual storytelling to share impactful stories that inspire action. While pursuing his master's in multimedia photography and design at the Newhouse School at Syracuse University, he became the first recipient of the Alexia Student Conservation Grant and the Alexia Climate Change Grant. So now let me turn this over to Justin.
Thanks, Glenn, and good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, wherever you may be joining us from. I see some of you are starting to put in the chat where you're tuning in from. Feel free to continue doing so. We love to see that. And I just want to say thank you for being here and for holding the space to engage with stories of a changing environment, especially at a moment when our attention is being pulled in so many different directions. I first want to acknowledge the world we're stepping into this conversation from. We are living through a time shaped by conflict, economic strain, and deep uncertainty. Many of us are feeling the weight of global instability, leaving us with a sense of overwhelm or disconnection almost daily. And it can be difficult to hold space for long-term challenges like climate change, especially when the impacts feel far out of reach. But these realities don't exist separately from climate change. They are deeply intertwined. Questions of land, power, and industrial development sit at the center of this crisis, shaping who is heard, who is protected, and who is most at risk. Today's conversation invites us to move beyond the seemingly intangible aspects of climate issues and instead centers the lived experiences of environmental change across places and cultures. So we're really honored to be joined by three powerhouse storytellers whose work helps make these connections visible and tangible through the lived experiences, human realities, and physical landscapes where environmental change is unfolding. Their work asks us to reflect on how industry and development are transforming the environment and reshaping communities and relationships with the land. Peter Essick joins us from Atlanta, Georgia, bringing decades of experience documenting environmental change around the world. His work pulls back our viewpoint, helping us see the scale of industrial impact from above and the patterns that might otherwise be hidden. Pat Kane is with us from Yellowknife, bringing his perspective grounded in his own heritage from Northern Canada. His work reflects on connections between land, identity, and cultural continuity, reminding us that environmental change is also personal. And Sara Hylton joins us from Brooklyn, New York, bringing our focus to human rights and environmental justice. Her work highlights the stories of Indigenous communities with deep compassion and shows us strength and resilience. Together, their work does more than document change. It invites us to witness, to understand, and to empathize with the realities of global change through the local lived experience. These are not just stories about loss. These are also stories of resilience and the possibilities of different futures. At a time of global stress and overwhelm, this is a space to slow down and to open our minds and hearts to the lived realities of a changing world. So before we dive in, just to give you an idea of what's ahead, over the next hour and a half, you'll listen to these stories and presentations, and I invite everyone to share any questions as they come up in the chat. We'll take a couple of questions at the end of each presentation, which should run about 15 minutes each. And then once all of our speakers have finished, we'll have an open Q&A discussion at the end where I invite folks to come on screen and ask questions if you're comfortable doing so. And you can continue to type questions in the chat and we'll field those from there. So, with that, I'm excited to introduce our first speaker. So, we have with us Peter Essick, who's a photographer, author, speaker, and drone pilot with 30 years of experience working for National Geographic magazine, specializing in nature and environmental themes. Peter's been named one of the 40 most influential nature photographers in the world by Outdoor Photography magazine in the UK. And Peter aims to make photographs that move beyond documentation to reveal in careful compositions the human impact of development, as well as the enduring power of the land. Essick is the author of four books of his photographs: The Ansel Adams Wilderness, Our Beautiful Fragile World, Fernbank Forest, and Work in Progress, which he'll be sharing with you today. And Work in Progress focuses his lens on documentation of environmental and cultural changes in his hometown of Atlanta. So, with that, I'll turn it over to Peter for the next 15 minutes to share his
Mhm.
stories with you.
Okay, thank you, Justin, and I hope everyone can see the screen. I'm going to be speaking about a story that I've been working on recently. It's called Work in Progress, and it's drone photographs of construction sites all near my home here in Atlanta, Georgia. Um, So a few years back, I had received a commission to photograph the Fernbank Forest, and it's a 65-acre old growth forest right in downtown Atlanta. And there's wonderful 300-year-old trees, and I spent quite a long time trying to capture that. But then I realized that I really didn't, you really couldn't see that it was an urban forest. So in the past, I'd always tried to do aerial photos with a plane or a helicopter, but at this time, the drones were starting to get popular. So I decided to try and learn how to fly a drone. And this was the picture that I got where you could see the Fernbank Forest in the foreground, but you could see the background, which was the skyline of Atlanta, just to show how unusual it is to have this wonderful forest right in Atlanta. And so driving back and forth actually live about a half an hour east of downtown in Stone Mountain. I started to see a lot of what most of you have probably seen if you live in an urban area in the United States, which was a lot of construction going on and a lot of cutting down of trees. And so I looked at it and I thought, well, it's kind of okay, but I really had thought, maybe it would look a lot better with from a drone's perspective. So when I got that, I was just really excited that it sort of opened up a whole new area of possibility. So I thought I need to do a little bit more research about kind of what's all involved as far as with construction in this area. So if you look at this small map, the Piedmont Forest is basically the foothills of the Appalachians, and it goes all the way from Birmingham, Alabama, all the way up to Washington, D.C. And this is the area where you get most of your development. People don't normally put their homes on the top of the mountain. They put it in the foothills and in the East Coast, this is from about 600 to 1,200 feet elevation, and Atlanta is right in the middle. So this is the area where you get most of the development. And you can see from this, from 1950, the center area, which is the white, I'm sort of just on the eastern end of that. And this is sort of the classic sprawl. Atlanta is known as the city of trees, and it was actually developed later than some other East Coast towns. But since 1950, there's been pretty heavy uh, urbanization, sprawl, and that has been with a lot of the construction of housing and also commercial things. And so I found this USGS study that showed if we continue the current rate of development by 2060, we'll have basically one big suburb that would go from about Atlanta all the way up to Raleigh. And if this happens, it would the canopy would be reduced by 23 million acres, and that's equivalent to all the trees in Kentucky. So obviously, it's going to have a large impact if we continue to do this construction. So I set out, and I found out that these types of what they call multifamily units are what's in the most demand, and there's approximately 4 million units shortage. So the developers are just trying to meet the need, and these are they call them 5/1s. You can build with wood up to 6 stories, and so this is where you're seeing a lot of the development in this area. And then right about this time, I saw a 60-minute segment that said that the real ground zero for all this development is the Sun Belt, and the two cities where there's the most development is Jacksonville, Florida, and Atlanta. Um, so I started out, and part of the idea was that I really wasn't trying to include the construction workers or the people. I was trying to focus more on the impact of the land. But this was one picture early in the morning where these two construction workers were going out to their, vehicles, and they were crossing over some of the big piles of soil. Um, and this was a school that was being built near my house. And I found that you can see they're just sort of filled up with water. After a rain, the construction workers kind of have the day off. So I kind of took a lot of pictures then, and also it kind of would saturate the colors. But this was what I was really looking for, was to just show some of the designs that made up kind of the modern construction. And this was a kind of the classic where you have a kind of a new subdivision. And here in Atlanta, we have what they call the Georgia red clay. I'm originally from California, so I wasn't really used to that, but it made for some interesting pictures. And then on the left, you see where they sort of would roll out the sort of the turf, and then actually they would spray paint it, which I thought was kind of interesting, the green. And a lot of these multifamily units, they have the pool at the clubhouse. And so the three major environmental issues that you have with construction is, first of all, is the wood, which obviously, comes from trees, and sometimes can be, recycled wood, but most of the time it isn't. And then concrete, which turns out it takes a lot of greenhouse gases to produce because you have to have a very high temperature. Um, they're just trying to figure out if there's any way to do it with any kind of alternative energy, but for the most part, you're burning oil to produce your concrete. And then steel, which also takes a lot of greenhouse gases. So overall, construction is about 20% of greenhouse gases. That's part of the main issue with climate change. So it's a major factor that sometimes we think about more electric vehicles and transportation, but actually housing is a major factor. Um, and this, I'd never seen this before, but when you get into the uh, commercial buildings, they put all the electricity in the floor, and then they'll eventually will, which is basically is copper wires, and then that is actually poured and covered with the concrete. It's all in sort of sealed in the flooring. So this is kind of how things start. It's kind of interesting where they actually mark the ground where and again, this is your Georgia red clay. So all these pictures were all taken within about 1 hour of my house. So uh, I really wanted it to be, I wasn't looking, to fly off to somewhere, the world's, biggest construction site. This is sort of the idea that this is what's happening just right in your neighborhood, and actually it's happening all across. I think most of these pictures could probably be taken anywhere in the United States, but we happen to be in a kind of a hot spot here in Atlanta. And some of the soil, and this is actually some of the waste. There actually is quite a bit of waste products. And I noticed the blasting that you would see. A lot of current construction sites, they always try and have it perfectly level. And so what they will do when they come up with a place that's where there's rocks, you can see they would drill these little holes where you can see the little red dots, and then they would use dynamite to blast it and break up the rock. And this was actually we're making a top golf, sort of a practice golf place, and the balls would go into the circle. And if you see the little small rectangle, they flow into that by gravity and then flow back to the front. And these aren't sugar cubes, but they're actually the roofing on the top of a large warehouse where they lift them up by a crane and then start the roofing. Mhm. And usually you would see the plywood. These are sort of the false floorings that they put in, and um, often they're just bare wood, but this particular site, they got a little creative and painted them all different colors. Mm. And the rectangular, this is another one of the multifamily units coming up. And, and this is in a more of the commercial buildings. Um, a large hospital, atrium. And we have a lot of these now, warehouses and the data centers. And if you noticed, up till now, I took all the pictures kind of straight down or almost straight down and didn't show the horizon. Um, when we put together the book of this work in progress, I had a few pictures like this, but it seemed to kind of break up the whole feeling of sort of like flying over the area. But eventually I took a few. This was another one. This was a refrigerated warehouse. Each one of those little squares eventually would have a autonomous vehicle would go in and retrieve refrigerated merchandise. And of course, all of these sites, one thing I found was interesting to think about is all of them are gone. The construction sites are kind of landscapes that are changing very rapidly. I think all landscapes change, but construction sites change really rapidly. But it all usually starts off with what they call the land clearing. And so, ultimately that comes down to a loss of trees. And like I said before, it's if you keep going like this, eventually you lose quite a bit of the trees, which are obviously they take in our CO2. Um, and these are ones that where they sort of salvage the logs. And this is my last picture. This is just, I think everybody, I don't think we'll ever get around the fact that people really want to have, the American dream, so to speak, of having your single family housing. So the demand, I think, is there. I think the real question is, can we build sustainably and maybe a little smaller or a little more smartly with recycled materials in the future. And it is possible. People have shown that. It's just that you just need the will to do it. So that's all I have. Uh, um, should I unshare?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take care of it.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, thanks so much, Peter. Just beautiful images and patterns, and I appreciate how you've been able to take something that's so close to home for you and give us a unique perspective on it. I think being so accessible to your hometown and knowing the lay of the land and then seeing that from the aerial perspective is what makes these images unique. And even some of those finer details of, the construction worker or a ladder to give that sense of scale. I know for me that for whatever reason, when I'm flying in an airplane, I always feel the most open-minded when I can really like visualize the scale and impact of things. And that's what I feel through these images. So thanks for sharing. And as a reminder to the audience, we can take a couple questions now. I don't see any in the chat, but feel free to, yeah, I see a raised hand. Feel free to unmute yourself and chime in here.
Oh, Peter, really fascinating images. I'm just
Thank you.
wondering, is there any, connection that you're seeing for using solar energy or anything that's like more environmentally, um, structured? Is there anything
Mhm.
that you're seeing that you can share?
Yeah, no, here in Atlanta, Georgia Tech has been at the forefront of that, and they have what's called the Canada House, and they've shown that it's actually a net positive for energy. And they have solar panels, and they collect all the rainwater, and they actually treat their wastewater in the basement. So uh, they've shown that, and then they've expanded it to a whole area. One of the pictures that I showed of some of that commercial area was what's called the Georgia Tech Science Center. So they've built a whole little area, and they're trying to make that whole little community net positive. So it is possible. I think the other issue is to use less concrete and less steel and more of the wood and um, recycled woods. So there's definitely areas that could be way, big improvements as far as more sustainable housing. Mm.
Well, I think if there's no other burning questions now, we should probably roll on and turn things over to our next speaker. So thanks so much, Peter.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate your perspective on this. So now we're going to move to Pat Kane, who's a visual storyteller based in Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories of Irish and Canadian and Algonquin ancestry. And Pat is a member of the Temiskaming First Nation. Pat is a National Geographic explorer, 2020 World Press Photo Jupe Swart Masterclass mentee, and the recipient of the 2024 Dr. Jane Goodall Vital Impacts Environmental Photography Grant. His work has been exhibited in galleries at festivals internationally, published in National Geographic, the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, and other publications worldwide. He takes a documentary approach to stories about life in northern Canada with a special focus on issues important to Indigenous people, including relationship between land and identity. So as we come from the pulled back view to a more grounded perspective, I'm going to hand it over to Pat to share his stories with you.
Pat, you need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Awesome. Okay. Bear with me 1 second. Okay. And you can see one slide there.
yeah.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks, Justin, Glenn, and Peter and Sarah. I see a lot of familiar faces in the crowd, which is great. Happy you tuned in to see Sarah and Peter, and by chance, myself too. So that's cool. So as Justin mentioned, my name is Pat Kane. I'm a photographer in Northern Canada, and I work on the traditional land of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation. Most of my work centers around Indigenous communities and issues around the environment and the impacts of colonialism. So I'm going to take you through two projects today. The first one centers around the oil industry in Alberta and how it's affecting the health of people who live nearby. The oil sands, as they're called, have been around for nearly 50 years, but I only really started hearing about them around 2007, which was shortly after I moved to the Northwest Territories. And I actually think I heard about them first through a photo essay that Peter did for National Geographic around that time. So in that same time frame, 2007-ish, there was a doctor named John O'Connor who's doing studies in nearby communities around the oil sands. And he noticed unusually high rates of cancer in the community of Fort Chipewyan, which is roughly 270 miles north of Fort McMurray. This doctor notified the Canadian health authorities, but instead of investigating his findings, Health Canada began investigating Dr. O'Connor instead, and they accused him of causing undue alarm, as they said. So Fort Chipewyan, or Fort Chip, as it's often called, is one of the oldest settlements in Canada. It was an important trade hub and exchange center that linked trappers from the northwest of Canada to the east in Ontario and Quebec during the early fur trade. The hamlet sits at the edge of the Athabasca, Lake Athabasca, with the Athabasca River, Slave River, Peace River, and Birch Rivers all flowing through it. It is home to Dene, Cree, and Métis people, now formerly known as the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, the Mikisew Cree First Nation, and the Fort Chipewyan Métis. So the water and the land is central to their history and their traditional food sources. In 2009, I visited Fort Chipewyan for the first time, and I spoke with residents about the oil sands and the health issues there. Residents and doctors like John O'Connor say that the pollution from the industry had caused the water and wildlife to become contaminated, which has led to severe illness in the community. One of the elders kept a logbook of all the people who had died in the past decade or so. Many of the people listed here died from cancer or other related illnesses. This past November, I went back to Fort Chip, and it was a story for the New York Times by Emily Baumgartner Nunn. Emily's reporting found that in over 3 decades, the rate of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma had been more than 2.5 times what would be expected for the hamlet. Cervical cancer had occurred at 4 times the expected rate, and the rate of bile duct cancer in men had been more than 9 times the expectation. And for other biliary tract cancers, the rate was 13 times what was expected. But then came the familiar disclaimer from the province and federal health departments. The small population size of Fort Chip limits the ability to interpret the results, they said. Many residents work at the oil sands, and the oil companies finance things that the community needs, like schools, recreational facilities, and cultural events. Without the jobs and investments, and some would say bribes, the hamlet would have few opportunities for employment in a part of Canada that's extremely expensive to live in. The people in Fort Chip are kind of caught in a dilemma of having economic prosperity at the expense of environmental and health concerns. It's a bit like making a deal with the devil. Calvin Wakwan manages the local gas station in Fort Chip. Behind the counter, he collects memorial cards of friends and family who have died. In the past 10 years, Calvin has buried 5 family members, 3 of whom have had cancer. Kenneth Whiteknife and his wife, Claire Cardinal, both worked at the oil sands for over 20 years. Kenneth is a double lung transplant survivor, and Claire passed away from breast cancer in 2024. Kenneth said that Claire had undergone more than 200 rounds of chemotherapy before her death. Alice Rigney lost her nephew, Warren John Simpson, to the rare bile duct cancer. She sat next to him while he passed away. I just want my land back, she says. No amount of money will change that. Here are graves at a cemetery in Fort Chip. The community has recently developed land on the outskirts for a second cemetery because this one is so full. Nearly everyone in Fort Chip has known someone who has died of cancer. In the mid-2000s, residents began reporting fish with visible tumors. In 2014, 2 First Nations collaborated with scientists to publish a study which found elevated levels of contaminants in muskrat, moose, and duck. But there are some detractors in Fort Smith. Robert Granjam, the man in this photograph, says that some people may exaggerating these claims because they want money from the oil companies, he says. I'm not exactly sure what he means by that. But Robert continues to fish and trap and says there are no issues with the wildlife. Today, the Canadian government is on the verge of allowing oil companies to release wastewater called tailings directly into the river system, so long as they use a filtration system beforehand. But scientists say there are no proven methods to ensure that the wastewater will be 100% clean. This is a tailings pond beside the Suncor operation outside of Fort McMurray. Scarecrows help ward off birds and ducks from using the tailings ponds. Environmentalists are worried about the implications well beyond Fort Chipewyan. The river basin to the tailings that the tailings will be released into flow north to the Northwest Territories and eventually empty out into the Arctic Ocean. This is the Syncrude facility outside of Fort McMurray. Mike McCurdy, a counselor for the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, has challenged federal and provincial regulators in the past, even daring them to drink a glass of water from the Athabasca River. Like others in Fort Chip, he's hoping the government abandons its plans to release tailings into the water system. We could all move elsewhere just to be funeral operators for how often we bury our people, he says. So my next project that I want to talk about is called Equo. And Equo means caribou in the Clecho Yaqui language spoken by the Dene people in the Northwest Territories. In 2024, I was awarded the Dr. Jane Goodall Environmental Photography Grant by Vital Impacts to work on this project over the course of 1 year. And Sarah Lean was generous enough to be my mentor on this project. So in the 1980s, the Bathurst caribou herd had a population of nearly 500,000 animals. And then something changed. The herd began to dwindle. Today, there are less than 4,000 Bathurst caribou on the tundra, and that number continues to fall. The Bathurst caribou are now a species at risk and designated as critically low. Scientists are stumped by the astonishing population decline of caribou in the Northwest Territories. Some say the creation of diamond mines have disrupted their migration patterns and calving grounds. Researchers point out that climate change has impacted their food sources, while other experts say the rise in population of predators like wolves and grizzly bears is the cause. Others blame overhunting. Some wildlife observers believe it may be a combination of all of these factors. So this is the winter road between Yellowknife and the diamond mines. The mines use this road for equipment and supplies during the winter months. Some indigenous conservationists say that the mines themselves are not solely to blame for the demise of the caribou, but they say that the road has created more access for indigenous hunters to harvest caribou in the winter, which is not traditionally a time of year when caribou would be hunted. Still, treaty rights give indigenous hunters the legal right to harvest wildlife for food on their own land. In 2016, a group of indigenous researchers started a program to study the herd, identify why their numbers are so low, and find ways to save the caribou from extinction. The program, called Echo Nahojidike, uses a mix of traditional indigenous tracking techniques and Western research methods to study the herd and collect information about the caribou. Tiana Steinwan, a manager and researcher with the Clecho government, and also a former caribou monitor, says that the camps are a way for Clecho people to reconnect with the land and the wildlife, a key aspect of their life that has been lost due to colonization and hunting restrictions. Since we can't hunt the Bathurst herd anymore, the monitoring is a way to get back on the land and spend time with each other, she says. This is one of the camps. They have three of them now. This one is on Contoido Lake, it's called. And you can see it's just kind of a little outpost with tents and a little kitchen shelter and boats that we go out and see the land from. Here are some of the monitors. They bring youth out every once in a while as well to be part of it and to become future researchers themselves. We spend a lot of time in the kitchen shelter and just kind of be together. Elders will stop along the way and pick berries um, and be part of the land. Elders are actually a very important aspect to this program because they are the original eyes and ears of the area, and many of them grew up on this land. And so they know it like the back of their hand, really. It's quite amazing. So the program's methodology follows a specific principle drawn from the ways of life of traditional caribou harvesters to do as hunters do. Researchers used a holistic concept saying, we watch everything. And that comes from the Clecho elders that I mentioned. They watch from eskers or water crossing to track the details about the caribou, predators, changes in the landscape, and industrial activities. So reaching back into a rich reservoir of traditional knowledge, these researchers are charting a new way forward when it comes to managing the creatures that share indigenous lands. The program is founded on the belief that local people who rely on the land are in the best position to determine the health and future of the caribou. And that's it for my presentations. I want to thank you all again.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Pat. Such moving and inspiring imagery and stories told in a way that feels personal and I know is close to home for you as well. I especially appreciate how you're able to both bring in solutions and some of the native language, which I know is part of what's at risk and also the solution is preserving that in these communities that you're working with. So thank you for sharing that. And we have a couple minutes for questions if folks wanted to either raise their hand and ask Pat a question here live or put that in the chat. Feel free to do so. Yeah, Colette, go ahead.
Oh, hi. Oh, this is so fascinating. I'm in touch. I'm in Rockland County, New York, over near the Hudson River, and I'm in touch with the Ramapo Lenape Delaware tribe. So I could see some very succinct kind of things that are very similar to the native tribe. And can you just put in the chat the three tribes that you've mentioned so that I can know how to spell them? And
Yeah,
I,
absolutely.
yeah, and I really agree about the native languages. It's becoming more and more apparent that people who live on reservations really want the native languages to be reinstated, and for the children and the elders. Of course, the elders still learn the language, but a lot of them are starting to forget the various languages. So that's, I think, a big thing also that you've mentioned. But thank you. It's really fascinating. Excellent research and photography.
Thanks so much. Yeah, and you're right. Like language is one of the pinnacles and the keystones of, keeping not just traditionally, but like, on a very deep personal level, keeping indigenous ways of life alive and thriving for future generations.
Thanks, Colette. Does anyone else have any other questions they wanted to ask Pat now? I see one popped into the chat here. So I guess this is for both Peter and Pat. How do you both envision giving these important stories a longer life and more exposure? My understanding is they appeared in Nat Geo or the New York Times. That reaches a very curated audience. So maybe starting with Pat, did you want to speak to kind of how you're able to carve off more of this story beyond what you've published and how that's maybe continuing and trying to give it further exposure?
Yeah, I mean, so the first story was it was shot for the New York Times, and it was kind of the reporting was done by Emily. So as much as I would love for it to travel elsewhere, it's kind of a little bit out of my hands. The best I can do is, do presentations like this, for example, to try to get that out. But for the Caribou project, that was one I worked on for a year. And so I have a lot more, I own all the imagery myself, and it's my story. It's a very personal one too. So I'm allowed to kind of shop that around to other editors and publications, but also give presentations and festivals. Um, it's a lot of work doing all this kind of stuff to like get the word out. It's like a lot of it sometimes is out of our hands too. We're kind of at the whim of what editors want, what curators want. So I think the best I can do really is just like try to, you know, blast it out to as many people as I can. Hopefully it gets into some festivals and I get to do speaking engagements like this one. And, hopefully you can help spread the word along too. And, but yeah, it's definitely a collaborative approach in some aspects.
Yeah, thanks for that, Pat. I'll turn it over to Peter to share his thoughts. Peter, I know that you've published work in progress in your book. Do you have additional ways of engaging outside audiences with that project or other projects that you've worked on? And just a note, you're still muted, Pete.
Yes, the book is the main outlet. I do have a gallery here in Atlanta, Spalding Nick's Fine Art, and I've made quite a few prints all the way up to 40 by 60 size, and I've been pleasantly surprised at the popularity of a lot of the work. A lot of people from even construction companies, architects, to just individuals, usually with contemporary homes. Have been I've had some good success selling prints. I also have a stock agent that sells them just to illustrate issues about construction and building and the economy and things like that.
Thanks for your perspective on that, Peter and Pat. And I know I appreciate the question too, because I know that this is an ever-present challenge with some of these stories in terms of when you get into, ownership rights and how far you can take a story and trying to get as wide of a reach as possible, but also driving impact. And sometimes that's not always in quantity, but the quality of the audiences you're reaching, right? So, yeah, thanks for sharing. And then just to keep things on time here, I think we should move on to our final presenter, and then we'll come back as a group and have a open Q&A discussion here at the end where we can continue these conversations rolling. So I wanted to turn things over now to Sara Hylton. Sara is an award-winning Canadian National Geographic photographer and explorer, renowned for her compassion and intimate approach to documenting environmental and human rights issues. A graduate of the ICP, she holds her master's in arts in the International Conflict Studies from King's College in London. And her work focuses on gender, Indigenous rights, and the environment. In her appearance in outlets such as National Geographic, Time Magazine, the New York Times. Sara is a National Geographic explorer and has received prestigious grants from the Magnum Foundation, the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, and the International Women's Media Foundation, among others. Sara is a recipient of the National Magazine Award and is also faculty at ICP and an instructor at National Geographic Society's Photo Camp, where I know she's just coming back from. And she's currently based in Brooklyn, New York. So Sara, take it away.
Thank you so much. Please let me know if you can hear me properly and you
Yeah,
can see my
sounds
screen
good.
properly. Okay, amazing. Uh, Amazing work, Peter and Pat. Tough acts to follow. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. What an interesting discussion and conversation we're having here today. The work that I'm going to share, I see as sort of an extension of the same project that I've been working on for the past 10 years. And, it's an interesting segue because we went from Peter, who's sort of very aerial, if you will, to Pat, whose images are so beautiful and very ethereal, if you will. And then we go to my work, which is very portrait heavy. And I think it's an interesting segue. So, Pat and I both have work from Fort Chipewyan. So I will go ahead and start going through my work, but I wanted to share this first image because a lot of the reason why my work is portrait heavy is because I use this camera, which in a lot of ways limits me, and a lot of ways focuses me in on the portraiture and the sort of more intimate imagery that I make. So I share this map because a lot of people do not know where Saskatchewan is, which is still shocking to me, but this is where I'm from. I'm from Regina, Saskatchewan. And I have spent many years living in South Asia, and I continue to return to Saskatchewan and to Canada because I believe there's just so much work that needs to be done. And the first project I'm going to share, and probably one of the most impactful projects for me in my life, started with a project I worked on about missing and murdered Indigenous women in Saskatchewan. This was during the government's inquiry into the issue. And I remember reading newspapers and articles about it, and it was just so sort of surface level, just numbers. And I thought, well, who are the women who are actually being impacted by this issue? And so again, I used my portraiture and my sort of investigative skills, and I found locations of where incidents had happened in Saskatchewan, and I met with women and girls who had been dealing with this issue. They'd had somebody go missing, or a loved one was murdered. And so this project was really instrumental in sort of my own storytelling. And again, just very sort of portrait heavy, really collaborative approach. This is Tracy George Heese. Her mother had been murdered, and she chose to be photographed in this teepee with her mother's buffalo skin. And I really wanted to use this project not to sort of put my own vision on things, but to really try to use my camera as a way to make images that felt impactful and meaningful for these women. And so while I was working on that project, I realized that, you can't really talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women without talking about the land. And so my work naturally progressed across the border into North Dakota and Montana in a dense oil region called the Bakken. I'd heard stories about how women were particularly vulnerable around large extractive projects, and I really wanted to integrate that into the work that I was already doing. And this, some of these images, I wish they were more interesting, but they stand to say something anyway. And this is an image of a man camp, and man camps are essentially these sort of transient temporary housing facilities where oil workers come, and they come in large numbers, and they stay often close to Indigenous communities. This is Kenny still smoking on Blackfeet Indian Reservation in Montana. Kenny's daughter, back in 1979, went missing, and he still has no answers. What I found during this project was that the oil region really did create a crisis, which was marked by increased violent crimes, sexual assault, and trafficking in the region. The rapid influx of temporary workers really impacted nearby tribal nations like Fort Berthold, and this was a significant factor in the increase of violence. I'll keep going. I know we don't have that much time. Uh, so that work, again, I sort of see this all as the same project, but again, this has been, I've been documenting these issues for a decade or so now. But this work's naturally progressed again into another project looking at water issues and oil. And I was lucky enough to receive a similar grant to, we received something called the Trebek Initiative. And I was supported to explore the relationship between water and oil, and how water is being impacted for Indigenous communities. So Canada has the world's third largest proven oil reserves, and we also have the world's third largest per capita freshwater reserves. I was really interested in looking at how this intersected, particularly for Indigenous communities who are usually on the front lines of climate change and water contamination. And so this is where I ended up in Fort Chipewyan, the same location that Pat had shared. So I won't spend too much time on this. But again, I took more of a portrait-driven approach to this. And I found many similar things to what Pat had discussed, elders discussing rising cases of bile duct cancer, other forms of cancer, water contamination, and the part that I was really paying attention to was the impact on the water source. And this is Kendrick Cardinal. He grew up in Fort Chipewyan. He says, I fished on Lake Athabasca and I trapped with my grandfather my whole life. The government said that the fishing industry in Fort Chipewyan was not sustainable. They told us, you're not going to be able to fish the way you have for centuries. You're not going to be able to provide for your family the way you want to. He said they might not have even realized the impact of what they were saying. Alice Rigney here with her grandson. She says, since the 1970s, we've lived downstream from the oil sands industry, and Lake Athabasca is their toilet bowl. The industry has us in a corner. As Indigenous Dene people, for us to try to fight them, we would lose. And so we've had to compromise and come to an agreement where they're willing to work with us. It's a very degrading feeling. Again, many elders talked about changes to the water levels. This is Fred. His nickname was Jumbo Fraser. He said, when I was a kid, the water lines here in Lake Athabasca were much higher. We used to swim this water, and now we can't. I will end on another portion of this project, which was also related to water issues. This is in Nishnawbe First Nation, a remote Ojibwe community in Northern Ontario with about 300 members. The community has been under a boil water advisory for over 30 years now, the longest in Canada. This is Derek Munias. He says his skin is consistently scabby and itchy. He told me the first thing I'm going to do when I leave is take a long shower. I've never experienced that in here. You have to leave to get the water. Each member of the community gets an allotted amount of bottled water that is flown in from the government. Here, this is Martin Angus. He is boiling bottled water to bathe his newborn baby boy in the bathtub. This is Derek Munias again, collecting fresh water from a spring that's about an hour drive from the nation. You know, every generation is being impacted by this. Some people have never known what it is to drink fresh water. This is Anna Munias. She's never had access to fresh water. These are plastic bottles that the government has flown in to, solve the problem. Obviously, it's not being solved. It's having a measurable impact on this once pristine land. So Nishnawbe was, these were all important communities to incorporate and to work with. This work feels far from done. I think there's, as we've talked about, and as Pat has talked about, there's so much going on in Canada that most people don't really know about and will continue to happen with climate change and industrial contamination. And so this work feels like it's really just beginning for me. I feel very grateful to have the support to continue doing it, and that I have colleagues who are also on the same team as me. So that's it for now. Any questions?
Wow, thanks so much, Sarah. Such moving imagery and really heartfelt emotional storytelling. It really does hit deep, and these are universal human issues, but ones that, as you said, in the communities you're working with are multi-generational. And it's really hard to witness that, but such important stories to tell. I do have a question from the audience, but before I go into the audience questions, I did just want to ask, because I think it's an important note to make here. Something that's notable about your work, in addition to being more focused on the portraiture, is that you're making the creative choice to shoot in square or medium format. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to your choices there and how you feel that adds to the narrative or kind of helps amplify the voice of these communities you're working with.
That's a great question. Yeah, I think it's layered. one, it helps me slow down. We all know film is very expensive, so it's not something that I can just, hope I get. I'm really sort of taking time, and with that means it is more collaborative because I am taking more time, and it feels intentional. It feels more intentional for my practice. I also think it's just a more, square in general is a better format for me. I see better with square, and portraits to me naturally fit better with 6x6. And I just love the process. It feels really, it sits at my heart. And so I can really look at people and connect with people, and yeah, it works well for me.
Yeah, I love that. And just quick follow-up, I'm curious how that's been received and when you're approaching the communities, in showing up with a medium format and how they maybe respond to that as opposed to if you were to come in with a different medium.
Oh, people love it. They're so fascinated by it. But, I think they're so used to seeing phones or big clunky things, and they see this thing that looks like a toy, and they're
Mhm.
just really fascinated by it. And I think that also helps me because they're like, "Wow, she really is like she's really doing something different here. Let's see what she can do." So yeah, I think it's actually helped a lot.
Love that. Okay, and so we do have a question specifically for you, Sarah, from the audience here that relates to how you're working with your participants and projects here. And so um, someone asked, did you feel challenged as a non-Indigenous person photographing and telling stories in Indigenous communities? Maybe you could speak a little bit about the relationship building process there.
Definitely. And I think there are many important conversations to be had around that because there's such deep layers of trauma from, outsiders and white folks with Indigenous communities. And I sort of see it as an opportunity to hopefully try to change that narrative and to try to actually reconcile. Not that I can ever possibly do that on my own. Or even attempt to try to do that, but my approach can at least, incorporate how they want to be seen, where they want to be seen, what stories they want to tell, what quotes they want to include. And so for me, it's a very informed consent approach where I'm just constantly checking in and constantly asking, does this caption feel good to you? Is there anything you'd like to change? What location feels meaningful to you? And so it's really very much less about me trying to impose anything at all and really just asking a lot of questions. But I certainly am constantly asking myself, am I the person to do this work? I don't necessarily have the answer as 100% yes. Uh, but I'm from Saskatchewan, and there's a lot of work to be done in Saskatchewan. And so I'm going to keep doing it. And hopefully, I'll do it in an ethical uh, and meaningful way.
Yeah, thanks for your perspective on that. Such important ethical considerations and just to keep it an iterative process even beyond when you're completing the project and continuing to touch those nodes and engage with the communities beyond is so important. These are long-term relationships. And so there was a question from an audience member about just hearing about the collaborative work with Indigenous communities. I'm not sure if there was a specific focus on that question, but maybe Sarah and Pat, would you be willing to speak about how you're collaborating with these communities, whether through these stories or beyond?
Yeah, I mean, I have a whole other presentation around this whole thing if interested down the road. But I think Sarah kind of nailed it with like her approach is kind of like the ideal approach. And, it's one of the reasons I admire her and her work is because we need more photojournalists and journalists in general that take that approach. I try to in my work as well. I am Indigenous, as you noted off the top, but my name is from my Irish ancestry. I have blue eyes. I'm fair skinned. People don't automatically know that I'm Indigenous right off the bat. So I don't, it's not like I have a free pass to like walk into any Indigenous community, and they're all very different. And say, here's my status card. Let's hang out. People are not, that they don't care. But I think it's important for the media to understand our role in colonization. I always say that the camera was like a tool in colonization from the early days. And so we have to be aware of like how we use that tool and like what we show and what we don't, and not to edit ourselves, but to kind of like be able to see what the trauma has been, what the impacts of photography has done on communities, and try to rectify that some way, some level. And I think like I've seen a lot of journalists that come into communities that are very just focused on the story, where we need to be like, let's focus on our our jobs as professionals is to, give people um, a sense of ownership of like their stories, and for us to kind of like be the mediator between what they want to say and how it gets shown to the world. So it's a bit of a responsibility on our side for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you nailed it. It is a responsibility moving from that sort of more extractionary approach to just not even collaborative, but just spending time on the ground and really engaging and being a human, right? In addition to being a storyteller. I think that's so important. And there's some more questions here, but I think this is an important point to stem off of. I did have a question for all of you, kind of generally, big picture, and I wanted to start. Um, by asking each of you to respond. Maybe if you'd be willing to speak to, these are obviously taking large, complex issues and trying to make them feel personal, whether that's through one character or one place or landscape. I'm curious if you could speak to how you go about deciding whose stories to center and why, and then also kind of coupled with that, who is too often left out of these stories, if you'd be willing to speak to that. So maybe I'll start with you, Peter, since you were first, and we'll move in the order of presentations here. If you could share either from work in progress or from previous projects, how you think about, whose stories to center in these issues.
Um, hmm. Well, it's for the work in progress. I'd always been uh, really admired a lot of the they call the new topographical photographers, Robert Adams and Louis Baltz, and that sort of started back in the 1970s, where they would look at landscapes not like Ansel Adams with just the wilderness, but look at the places where we actually lived. And so I thought that after World War II, things, just so changed that we really needed to, as a landscape photographer, to really, look at it's okay to look at the wilderness, and I love being in those kind of places, but to also photograph, the places where regular people live. And so I sort of saw the drone as just, it was new to me, and I sort of got fascinated with it as just sort of a different way to sort of show, um, the landscape in ways that people don't see when you drive by these construction sites. A lot of people don't even give it a second look, and it's one of those things that's hard to photograph, hard to make really interesting. But I tried to make the visuals, be my way of sort of, getting people involved or interested in what is a an important environmental issue. Mm.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're shifting our perspectives, and it's cool to hear
Yeah.
that also you've been able to give yourself a new perspective
Mm.
from your own hometown as well in that approach.
Yeah.
Pat, did you want to share your thoughts on how you approach story and kind of deciding whose stories to center or who often is too often left out?
Yeah, I mean, most of my work does center around indigenous communities and people and kind of like the issues they face. For example, the oil sands is kind of a good one because it's like a bit of a black and white situation there. But I try to also um, realize that a lot of the communities kind of depend on the oil industry or like industry in general. And there are a lot of indigenous people that actually want that development to happen. So I
Mhm.
really need to remind myself that, as a photojournalist, I'm not an activist. I need to still like have balance and to learn myself. I went to a community on the West Coast that was a um, they're basically like a LNG, like a liquefied natural gas port. And there's this one community, Kitimat, who they're 98% of their population wants industry because they're kind of like, I'm tired of like being the on the receiving end of like decisions that are made by the government. So I kind of want to um,
Mm.
take control of my future. And if we're going to do this, then let's make sure that my family and my family's family has is compensated for that. So a lot of those people are very pro development and pro industry, um, which is like very interesting. I think very surprising to a lot of people that think indigenous people are just one group that want to protect everything and in the world. And I think that's a little bit true, but it's not entirely true. So it's important to keep those voices in there. For example, that one picture of Robert who's throwing the fish. He's very skeptical of what people say, and so I think it's important to include him in that story as well, because there are so many voices that say the opposite, right? And then it's up to the audience to judge what where it goes from there. But yeah, anyway, I try to have a bit of balance, but also knowing that the indigenous perspective is where I come from on most of my stories.
Absolutely. I think that's so key. Sarah, did you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Pat entirely, and especially, in talking about the work that we shared today, I usually try to refer to the knowledge keepers, the elders, the women, and also remind myself that those people, especially the elders, are usually the most outspoken and usually the most willing to share, because of their wisdom, because of their knowledge. And sometimes, you know, the quieter person is also important to include and listen to, or the person who might be a little ambivalent toward you, or who might require a little more patience and a little longer conversation. So I think sometimes, like, the easiest person isn't always the one that needs to be the center.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, all three of you, for your thoughts on that. There's a couple more questions from the audience here in the chat. This one is specifically for Sarah and Pat, but I guess kind of building on the Indigenous voices question here. They say, I'm curious if there are places in which Indigenous voices may be heard to impact change. Is the extraction industry just a given? Is there hope within the communities you're documenting that they will be heard, that extraction will strike a balance with Indigenous knowledge and traditions? So kind of a big question there, but maybe this individual can come on and clarify too if I didn't quite get at the core there. But Pat or Sarah, did you have thoughts on how to yeah, how to better voice these concerns within the indigenous communities and whether you're seeing a strike of balance between their knowledge and traditions as well as the kind of the drive for extraction industry.
So is the question kind of like, is there hope for the communities
Mm.
without industry? If that's the question, I think my answer is yeah. Like I think a lot of the times people in the communities get the impression that this is their only hope for an economy. And that's pushed by a lot of government, a lot of lobbying, a lot of big industry, who have the resources to put this into the minds of a lot of leaders in the communities. And then those leaders bring that down to their residents. Um, but I think there are like NGOs that help out people with traditional economies. A lot of these communities are on the mouths of rivers or on lakes. So there's like tourism potential. There are fishing potential if the industries aren't polluting the water and the land. So I think there is potential, but also with conservation. There's like a ton of money being put into conservation initiatives through the government of Canada and other NGOs. And I think there's a lot of like training and work and jobs that can come through stewardship and national parks and those kinds of things. So yeah, I think there is. It's just it needs a little bit of the pullback from industry saying that this is the only thing and you're going to be nothing without us.
Yeah, thanks for your thoughts on that, Pat. Sarah, did you have anything to add?
I think Pat covered that pretty well. I would just say that I think there needs to be alternatives. Because even just looking at Fort Chipewyan, you walk around the community and you see, the big homes, and those big homes are the folks that work for industry. And that's usually the best, most straightforward option for people to make a good income. And so, it's like the quote that I had shared with Alice Rigney. It's a really degrading feeling because you're basically making agreements with the devil. And in order to not do that and protect your land, you need alternatives and something that is equally livable, and sustainable. And so I think it requires a big shift in government policy and not sort of continuing on as business as usual.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you both for your thoughts there. We've got about 8 minutes left. I wanted to just be sure we got to everyone's questions here, so maybe I'll go ahead and open the floor. If anyone has any questions that they either put in the chat and I didn't get to, or wanted to add in on this conversation, feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself here and ask our panelists while we've got them here. And if we don't have any raised hands, I'll just continue ahead with my list of questions here. Colette, did you have one?
I was thinking about a PBS special I saw on the Philippines and how similar the native structure was to what was happening in the Philippines. I saw it a while ago, so I don't remember everything, but again, because of my friendships, if you will, with the Ramapo Lenape, and I have relatives that are also Native American, not those tribes. But I just there's a similarity to, what happens with the environment, how the environments are poisoned, how the people are dying, how the government officials are not paying attention to these people who are dying. But in the case of the Ramapo Lenape, they did get a little bit of a suit in Ford versus Mann. Mann was the family that was connected to the Ford Foundation in Hudson Valley, New York. So, you just see the similarities and they're so painful, but it definitely makes me want to just, go back and uh, just reunite. We kind of see each other every once in a while. Last time I saw folks was like at an elders luncheon. So, but it's difficult to really reach out unless you're right in it. Sometimes the communication thing gets, even with the social media, I missed the elders luncheon last year because the communication wasn't clear as to when it was. But this year I really followed up on it. I stayed on top of it and said, I'm coming in as a photographer and as a friend, but people know me, in that community. So it was really just kind of a comment, but just to see the similarities with native populations and what they go through, and how the land is taken. I mean, I certainly keep hearing stories about the Shinnecock in Long Island and how much land that they've lost over the years, and the gentrification. It's just similar. It's colonialism. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for your comment there, Colette. I think you're absolutely right. It is something that's universal across tribes, cultures, places globally, and I'm glad to hear that you're able to show up to some of those conversations in person. Um, I see we've got a couple other hands raised. Kathleen, you were first. Do you want to chime in with a question or comment here?
Yes, I wondered if someone could talk about any alternative economies that have developed, specifically around development of parks or cultural kinds of parks. Living in the States, I haven't seen too much of that, and it would be great to hear of some places where it's been successful as kind of models for us to learn from.
That's a good question.
Yeah, I can speak to that. There is a national park called Nene, which is east of east of Yellowknife, where I live in the Northwest Territories. And I forget how big it is, but in comparison, like it's massive. It said it's like 16 Manhattans inside of this landscape. Um, but this is Canada's newest national park. It was officially announced in 2019, I want to say. And from that, they started a Guardians program, kind of like a Wardens program for the Indigenous people in that community. So they'll become stewards of the land. They will be interpreters, rangers. They have other names for all these titles, but that's essentially what they're doing. And they're building infrastructure, trails, walkways. There's tour operators that are starting fishing outfits there. So just from this one national park, it's one of the first Indigenous-led national parks in Canada as well, which means that Parks Canada is a partner in it. They're not the leader in it, which is unique for North America. So I think that's one way in which people are kind of finding an economy within conservation, in my neck of the woods anyway.
Yeah, thanks for that example, Pat. So I see we've got a few minutes left and another question here, so maybe let's round out this conversation with one more question from Helen, and then we'll wrap things up here. So Helen, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Sure. As I was listening to these presentations, I flashed back on a talk that I heard in person a long time ago from a photographer who had done a big project of the Canadian tar sands. And, so a lot of what you guys have been talking about reminded me of that. I also remember leaving the talk feeling very worried about this man because he sounded so depressed. Like I really felt concerned about him. I was wondering, because obviously you're all dealing with people who are sick and people who's, you know, up against a lot of serious problems, and none of you strike me the way that guy did. But I was just wondering how you keep yourself balanced, and how you kind of take care of yourself and when you're photographing this kind of stuff and directly, we're looking at pictures, but you're right there with these people.
I I can speak to that a little bit because I was one of those photographers that did a story about the Canadian oil sands, and it was a very difficult story to do compared to other National Geographic stories that I'd done. Once I got up there, um, all the oil companies basically said, no, we won't give you any access. And then, which I was sort of expecting, but what came after that was that when a lot of the people who were working there, who were making pretty good salaries, they didn't want to be photographed either because they saw it as a sort of a threat to their job. Um, so I had to really hustle around just to find, things to do. And eventually, if you just keep at it and stuff, it worked out. But there was a depressing side actually to that landscape I found because uh, it's very bleak looking, it's all the trees are gone and there's no greenery and it's just kind of so I can kind of relate to I don't know the photographer that you were speaking about, but there is a depressing aspect to that landscape up there. I think especially I didn't go in the winter time, but I can imagine from what I've heard they have a pretty high, alcoholism and drug problem because it's just, um, you know, the actual, conditions that you have to live through. So, but I think all of us, I don't know what Pat and Sarah, but at some level you have to keep moving and keep doing your job, and you want to feel the issues and things, but not to the point where it totally breaks you down, I think.
Yeah, thanks for your thoughts, Peter. It's an important question and one that unfortunately we don't have a ton of time for, but
Yeah.
could probably warrant a whole discussion in and of itself. And I think it's also a good reminder to all of us to take care of ourselves first and also I'd encourage you all to think about, what's giving you hope and what keeps you going. But we're unfortunately at time, so I wanted to just thank everyone for coming and let's give a big round of applause to our presenters today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
This is really amazing. It's a huge conversation, super important topics that we're discussing today that I hope to continue in the future. And Glenn, did you have anything you wanted to add as we wrap things up here?
Well, I just want to thank the presenters, Peter, Pat, Sarah, for a remarkable job today. I want to thank everybody for being here. And I really appreciate bringing this discussion to the people and the environment that are being affected by industry. For the past 2 years, we've had panels on climate change, and I felt it was time to kind of bring the discussion really back home and really see the impact of industry on the world today. So thank you for this. Thank you, Justin, for doing a great job moderating, and hope to see everybody at future panels.
Mhm.
Thanks, everybody. And this is being
Thank
recorded.
you.
We'll post it to
Yeah.
our YouTube channel, and everybody who's registered for this event will get a link to the recording in a few days. Okay, thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Nice.